regarding Black homeownership and land legacy. I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to have this panel. Thank you for having this, because as we consider the mission of the 3x30 and 3 million net new homeowners, it's important to consider sustaining the home ownership and also considering some folks who will be new homeowners but through a different method of acquiring property. And so we will, to begin this discussion, starting with talking about the historical context and some of the current implications of some systemic issues, and then going to talking about solutions to address some of those issues. So my name is Natasha Moodie. I'm a research associate at the Housing Assistance Council, which is a national nonprofit intermediary that supports affordable housing and community development in rural America. And I would like to introduce my fellow panelists here. We have Dr. Andrew Kahrl, who's a professor at the University of Virginia, researching and teaching courses on African American history. Andrew is a very successful author, most recently publishing The Black Tax, 150 Years of Theft, Exploitation, and Dispossession in America. We also have Nketia Berko, who is an Equal Justice Works Fellow at the National Consumer Law Center. Inc. focuses on legal assistance and policy reform to enable Black families to stay in their homes and transfer homeownership to the next generation. Inc. also works with legal services programs in the DC area to provide legal advocacy and representation for Black residents with tangled titles. We're also joined by Kevin Cameron, Director of Federal Government Affairs at the American Land Title Association. Kevin has worked in political, fundraising, advocacy roles, working on campaigns with senior members of Congress, and now Kevin works as a government affairs professional with a well-rounded perspective to strategy development and execution. So thanks to the panelists for being here. So to start us off, Andrew, would you be willing to share more about your research and your findings around the historical context and implications of taxes, tax sale laws, and more about your work, please?
Sure. So thank you for having me here this afternoon. It's a real pleasure and honor to be able to speak with this audience and be able to sort of present some of my work that looks at the history of racial discrimination and inequity in local tax systems and its role in fueling many of the problems that have been discussed all day today. And I wanted to begin by referencing a recent example headline from the news that perhaps many of you are familiar with. That was from earlier this year when the Johns Hopkins history professor Nathan Connolly and his family settled a lawsuit against the mortgage lender Loan Depot over an appraisal company's undervaluation of their home. In 2022, the African-American family sought to refinance the mortgage on their Baltimore home, but when the appraisal they received was suspiciously low, they sought a second appraisal, except this time they whitewashed their home, removing all evidence that a Black family lived there and had a white colleague pose as the homeowner during the appraisal. The second appraisal they received was $300,000 higher than the initial estimation. Now, this family's experience is the latest example of a more familiar problem, the racist devaluation of Black-owned properties in African-American neighborhoods by various segments of the real estate industry. And this racialization of housing markets really beginning in the early 20th century, this drawing of the color line, which was foundational to the industry's formation and growth in the 20th century, made white property, worth more because it was white, and made its value and continued appreciation contingent on the exclusion of the poor and people of color from these markets. And conversely, it made Black property worth less because it was Black, limiting its future appreciation, and with it, the ability of homeownership to be the kind of vehicle for wealth building that it has been for generations of middle-class white households. All the while exposing African-American home seekers, minority neighborhoods to all manner of exploitation from this exclusion. But there's this other feature of housing markets that's been just as pervasive as the devaluation of Black homes and minority neighborhoods on the market. And that's the overvaluation of lower value properties in Black-owned neighborhoods and the undervaluation of those higher valued ones for tax purposes. Today, nationwide, African-American homeowners in Black neighborhoods are overassessed for taxes by on average, 10 to 12%. In some markets, it's much, much higher. And this is in addition to the overall regressivity of property taxes, which is well established as a feature of how property taxes are administered, namely that lower valued properties are assessed higher relative to value than higher valued properties. Now, because African American properties are worth less because of race, that means that they're taxed even more further still. So when combined, this really means that black homes and neighborhoods are assessed upwards of 45% above what they should be paying in taxes, which drives down the value of black-owned homes, further raising the cost of housing for black Americans and making the homes that black people own more expensive to hold and easier to lose. Now, these present-day realities form the backdrop to my book, The Black Tax, which is a 150-year history of racial discrimination and inequity in local tax systems and its cost for generations of black Americans and its role in shaping housing markets as a whole. And the book explains how this structure of local taxation in America became, in a sense, structurally racist, and how it has consistently undermined black homeownership and wealth building in America. Now, this overassessment and overtaxation of the homes and land that African Americans have owned and the places where they live, as I estimate, and the most conservative estimate, is that it has robbed black Americans of at least $300 billion since Reconstruction. Now, my book also sort of follows the money from black taxpayers' hands into local treasuries and then into the public budgets and spending decisions of local governments, showing how African Americans have also been consistently underserved when it comes to the public goods and services that local taxes go to support. And that's none greater than public education, which again has forced African Americans now to pay more while receiving less. And of course, as we all know, the quality of those public goods and services, like public schools, goes far in shaping the value of those homes as well. Now also, the third sort of leg of this three-legged stool that my book sort of focuses on is tax enforcement. And so when it comes, when people fail to pay their taxes on time, they are subject to tax liens, and in many states, including the District of Columbia, the local government will sell those tax liens to private investors at what are known as tax lien sales, which have created this lucrative marketplace for essentially preying on financially distressed homeowners, and in many states and localities, allowing them to take their property all for the price of a single unpaid tax bill. African Americans here also have been disproportionately victimized by these local tax delinquency laws. This predatory practice, as I sort of argue in the book and show, by way of cities like Washington, D.C., has been an instrument of gentrification and black displacement, and been a causal force of African American land and home loss over the course of the 20th century, which has been documented to be upwards of 11 million acres that African Americans have been dispossessed of in the 20th century alone. So my work kind of calls attention to these features of local tax administration and enforcement that have really been kind of flying under the radar in many of these discussions about the driving forces of inequality in housing markets. And again, that question of why has housing and homeownership not worked in the same way for black Americans as it has for other groups of Americans. Also answering this, addressing this question of, what have been the forces that have been fueling the racial wealth gap over the course of the 20th century and still today. And along with it, again, why has segregation and inequality remained these defining features of America's public educational system? And how are all these problems tied to housing markets and the source of local public funding, which are real estate markets? So again, this is a sort of history, again, that I think is one that is very much unresolved. My book really is sort of focusing on problems that have been long-standing. They've taken different forms and had different effects, but they are ones that by no means are in the past. Tax lien sales continue to remain a sort of real crisis in many low-income neighborhoods. Black-owned homes continue to be overassessed, and we continue to see great disparities in public funding for the local goods and services that these tax dollars pay for. So that's kind of sort of where my book sort of seeks to intervene in these discussions, and again, I sort of hopefully provide a little bit of historical backdrop here to the problems we're going to address this afternoon. So thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for that background and history from your research. A lot of what we will continue to discuss in this panel today really relates to that, because when it comes to those predatory tax sales and folks are disproportionately affected by those, by losing their homes to tax sales, actually intersects a lot with heirs property, which is what we'll discuss as well today. And they're both impacts of systemic design that are disproportionately affecting Black communities. And so I'll transition into speaking a bit about the research that the Housing Assistance Council conducted in collaboration with Fannie Mae around heirs property. This clicker. There we go. So I know we've heard heirs property mentioned a lot today, but to start, I want to share the definitions that the Housing Assistance Council used in their research, and also not to assume everyone's exposure to this topic. So heirs property are traditionally created when a property owner dies without a will or some other form of estate planning. Then that property is transferred to their descendants in a shared interest where no one person has clear claim to that property. And that creates a multitude of issues that I'll go into in a moment. But for the purposes of looking at the impacts on folks' access to housing and housing finance, the Housing Assistance Council also looked at properties where the owner does have estate planning, but they choose to leave that property to multiple descendants. So someone says, oh, I want to leave this to all of my children. But then for a multitude of reasons, those descendants do not go through the formal transfer of title, which in many states is the probate process. Then the title is unclear, and as the generations pass along, now we've created a complex, tangled title. And there are many reasons why. I mean, heirs property is just one product of systemic design, partially due to histories of systemic exclusion and exploitation from financial and legal systems. Particularly for Black residents and other residents of color, they were barred from participating in formal legal and financial systems, and so they had to find their own ways to decide amongst their families to pass on their properties through generations. So as they pass on the property in the ways their families have decided, over generations with that knowledge, today that knowledge that they've passed on through generation of how to pass on the property doesn't align with the formal and actually the legal system, what they need to be able to have full ownership of that property. In some cases, financial constraints contribute to the perpetuation of heirs property. The probate process and untangling a title can be costly depending on where someone resides and what their access is to the legal system and how tangled the title is. And so, those financial constraints can perpetuate the issue of heirs property. In addition, some families live in financial and legal deserts. The American Bar Association reported that 40% of all counties have less than one lawyer per 1,000 residents, and 196 counties are classified as legal deserts. So without being able to access the legal system, they're not able to do the estate planning, to clear the title, to be able to stop the creation of heirs property. And so why are we talking about this? Why is this important? It's because clear title is needed for market participation, to have agency as a homeowner, to be able to sell the home at market value if desired by the family. Clear title is also required to access the housing finance system, for loans, for rehabilitation, or to leverage the property, the equity in the property for the family's benefit. Clear title is also required for many forms of insurance, and in many states for full property tax exemption. It's also needed to access federal monies, whether that is for disaster recovery or rehabilitation or construction. So not having a clear title results in decreased agency for the property owner, as they're unable to access the needed financing or supports to pursue the visions for their homes. They're also vulnerable to land loss through forced sales, as Andrew was mentioning, with the tax sales, or being sought out by nefarious actors seeking property at low cost. And so there's regional research demonstrating that many properties sold in those predatory tax sales are heirs property, in some regions as high as 50%. And so a lot of the research suggests that the 90% of Black land loss that Andrew referred to earlier from 1910 to 1997 was in part due to this tangled title issue. And so with the loss of generational property, there's also a loss of generational wealth. And in areas with a high prevalence of heirs property, we see other systemic issues like low mortgage rates, low market participation, declining populations, and other systemic issues. And so while there's been over 40 years of heirs property research that's been ongoing, the Housing Assistance Council and Fannie Mae collaborated to gain an understanding about the housing impacts of this issue. We realized that there was a need to better understand the scope and the scale of this issue for residential properties. So due to data constraints, this study is a very conservative estimate for 44 states and DC. And even with a very conservative minimum estimate, there's still $32.3 billion tied up in residential heirs property, equity that's not accessible to these homeowners. And so as we mentioned, heirs property does not exist in isolation. Heirs with a high prevalence of heirs property tend to have other impacts of systemic disinvestment. And so one example of that is that persistent poverty counties, so counties with a poverty rate of 20% or higher over 3 decades, had twice the prevalence of heirs property in comparison to other counties. And so from a housing community development perspective, it's clear that there needs to be access to the legal system to be able to resolve these titles, prevent these issues, but there are also housing and community development impacts to the communities with a high prevalence of heirs property that also need attention. And so there are many benefits to addressing the issue of heirs property for households and communities. It can decrease vulnerabilities to land loss, increase ability to access and retain equity in the home, increase ability to access financing for rehabilitation, construction, full tax breaks, many things that will give agency to the homeowner. And so we had partners that we worked with in this research that shared many recommendations, but for the purpose of this conversation, I'll highlight those that intersect with housing finance. So there were calls from our partners for more inclusive definitions of homeownership that may recognize heirs property owners. There are also calls to see is it possible for there to be alternate forms of proof of homeownership to access housing finance products. Are there considerations? We heard many innovations today, of great innovations around underwriting processes and ways for folks to access financing. So are there ways to consider financial products that don't require a lien on owned land? We've heard from heirs property owners that after they fought for generations to hold on to their land, to then go for a financial product that if something goes awry, they lose that land in the end. They're not interested in those types of products because it's tapping into the very thing they're trying to prevent. There are also calls to see, are there ways for financial products in the housing finance space to include funding for those legal processes, for the legal fees, the court fees, for clearing liens, clearing tax liens? Are there ways to include all of those costs into rehabilitation loans or construction loans? Can we explore those options in the housing finance world, are the call that we're hearing from. And so, title resolution is not accessible for all residents, as you mentioned, the legal deserts and the costs, and there are many folks who are working tirelessly and doing amazing work in the legal space. And can housing finance and the housing sector come alongside to continue to support that work? We heard some examples of those innovations earlier today. And so, again, just mentioning that this will impact housing preservation. We work with partners in historic Black communities, and one statistic that we came across in the research is that at the height of historic Black communities, which are communities that were established by formerly enslaved persons, there were 1,200 of these historic Black communities. Today, only 30 exist. And in many of those communities, we hear from the folks on the ground working with the communities that they're getting calls daily, weekly from investors wanting to buy up the properties. And they're vulnerable because of these title issues to this land loss. So it's very important that the amazing work that we'll hear about later continues and there's more support and innovations to support heirs property owners. And so with that, I would like to transition to talking about some of the amazing solutions that are going on and advocacy for heirs property owners. So I'm wondering, now that we've kind of talked about the historic context of the taxes and with the heirs property, can you share some about your work and some of the solutions that legal advocates and governments can adopt to help preserve homeownership and support heirs property owners?
Yeah, definitely. And I think just touching up on what you and Andrew have been saying, I think it's important to frame this conversation by starting off with the fact that heirs property and the vulnerabilities that come along with heirs property aren't failures of families, but these are failures of systems, right? And so specifically the exclusion that the histories that have been, that so many of us have been talking about earlier today have resulted in. And so exclusion I'm thinking of in 2 ways. One is exclusion from the process of getting formal property ownership, and then secondly, exclusion from being able to define what property ownership looks like in this country. And so On the procedural point, that includes, again, some of the history that Andrew was noting, not just the violent land loss that many African-American families experienced over decades in the past century plus, but it also includes a lot of the fraudulent actions that led to folks, when they encountered the legal system, also losing their property. And so we have to keep that in mind so that we understand that this distrust that exists, this retreat from the legal system and from probate system and what have you, that these are all deeply rooted. And so every solution that we talk about has to keep that in mind as well. And then secondly, when I'm talking about the substance of property ownership, what I mean by this is the fact that many Black families and other marginalized communities as well, these are family homes. There isn't typically that private form of home ownership. It looks different than it may look for other families, that nephews, nieces, aunts, uncles, grandmas, grandpas, all coming through the home. And so there's a more communal form of home ownership that we have to also acknowledge in our definitions of home ownership, and who gets to be able to manage the property, and how do we make it easier for folks who are living in homes with multiple family members, folks with an interest, ownership, or otherwise in the property, allowing them to manage the property. So having said all of that, and really boiling that down to this access to justice issue, and then also these different forms of home ownership, I, at the National Consumer Law Center and others, we published a report earlier this year highlighting the 3 buckets generally of interventions that exist for addressing heirs property issues. And each of these solutions, they seek to reduce the vulnerabilities that are associated with heirs property, but also make it easier for families to get that sort of access to the legal system, so that if they so choose, they're able to resolve the property, they're able to clear title, consolidate title, and manage their property in a way that allows them to benefit from homeownership in this country. And so the 3 buckets generally are protecting heirs property from home loss. And so this includes programs that expand access to programs that exist for many other types of homeowners, such as property tax relief programs, disaster relief, accessibility, mortgage foreclosure prevention, and the like. And then the second prong, or the second bucket, is title clearing. So increasing the options and the availability of ways to consolidate home ownership. And so here, we include things such as adverse possession laws that make it easier for folks to get the home ownership from other heirs who have not been living in the home for a long time, allowing folks to prove that they've been paying the property taxes in a home and therefore get home ownership as well. And then also, quite simply, funding so that folks are able to clear title in their various places. And I'll talk maybe a little bit more about that, about the many programs, including in Washington, D.C., as I think we heard from a little bit earlier today, that make it easier for families to enter the legal system and then to clear out that title. And then the last bucket, or the last prong, is really preventing heirs property from developing. I think we're all very invested in increasing Black home ownership, and one of the best ways to do that is to ensure that when folks get into a home, they're staying into a home. I forgot who said it earlier today, but we're not just interested in home buying, increasing home buying, we're also interested in home ownership. And so by doing that, one of the ways we can do that is by ensuring that folks have easier ways to pass down title from one generation to the next. So whether that is increasing the ways for folks to avoid probate, or simplifying probate, because that is a time-consuming, costly, expensive process, or if it's by increased outreach to communities and to community organizations to meet people where they're at and help them to start the process of estate or life planning. All of these things have their place in ensuring that we're really preventing heirs property, and again, preventing, more importantly, the problems that are associated with heirs property. And I think we'll probably later on this panel talk a bit more on each of these different types of interventions and get more in detail there.
Great, thank you, Nk. Really appreciated your comments around the system versus, the ways that defining home ownership or the family property may look different for folks in the work that you've done. And so, Kevin, I know that in your work with ALTA, you also do advocacy work and supporting heirs property owners and have some collaboration. So, would you like to share more about your work and how you all have supported heirs, done this policy work?
Sure, absolutely. This is an issue that Alta and title companies across the country have been dealing with for decades. Advocacy recently, we found a great partner in NCLC and working on many issues, whether it be at the state level or the federal level. But I just want to take a step back and talk about, how this issue is resolved when you're talking about this resolution piece right here. Talking about the legal fees and the access to legal work, let alone being able to afford it if you can actually access a lawyer. You're talking about these legal deserts. But looking at it from the title perspective, as our members, are intervening with home buyers who are trying to clear titles and untangle these titles across the country, the legal part is one part. The other part is actually tracking down all of these heirs. I mean, the generational aspect of this, you may have dozens of heirs that have a partial claim to one property that you don't even know about. So our members are trying to, when they, are faced with a sale or a refinance with a family who has this piece of property that has no clear title to them, trying to help them clear this title. It is hours upon hours of work of trying to track down these heirs, because everyone had, the way that most states, everyone has a fractional ownership and has to sign off for good reason. Our members also run into the fact where, and I think Inc. made a reference to this about, speculators who find one spare heir who doesn't have any connection to the family anymore, may not even have known that they had a partial interest in a property, buys them out of that interest, and then forces a sale on the rest of the family. And unfortunately, far too often, that family is forced to sell at pennies on the dollar of what the equity of that home actually is. But sometimes it's not a speculator. It's just someone finds out they have a fractional ownership to this piece of property and just wants money out of it. And it's as simple as that at some points. Alta did a survey recently of our members about the curative work we do on just a bunch of different refinances and purchase transactions. We looked at the average transaction for our members to clear from order to closing is about 22 hours. But when you're looking at these more difficult cases, including issues of heirs property, you're looking at 44 to 45 hours on average of just title agent work. That's not talking about the lawyers, that's not talking about, and the average salary in the title industry right now is about $75 an hour. So you're talking about a lot of money to get these issues fixed, to make sure that folks can just stay in their home and protect the equity that their grandparents or great-grandparents or aunts and uncles or whomever, even if it's just their parents, even if it's just one generation down, being able to protect that home ownership. It's hard enough in this country to buy a home. It's worse to have to lose it by no fault of your own. And I think we can talk about, many of the great work that's being done at the state and local level, as well as the federal level now, thankfully, to try and address some of these.
Thank you, Kevin. So I think with your last comment, we can segue. Thank you if you're willing to share maybe some of the work that you're doing in DC and some of the other state work that you've been involved with or heard about that have been successful.
Yeah, definitely. So I work with partially with Legal Counsel for the Elderly based in DC, which is one of two legal services organizations that is receiving money under a grant from the district to help folks resolve heirs property issues, the other organization being the DC Affordable Law Firm. And so through this work, what we've been doing is working with clients who have probate issues, who need to clear out the estate, and funding their ability to do so. And also not just that, but also expanding the network of attorneys in the District of Columbia who are doing this work, building that capacity, and then also building this network and building these relationships. And so before maybe I continue on a bit more of that, I'm curious how many folks in this room have ever been the personal representative for an estate? Okay, one person. Okay, two. I'm going to guess that it wasn't a particularly enjoyable experience. I'm seeing, some head shaking. So this is something that is incredibly time consuming, it's complicated, and it's all the more difficult when you have so many heirs over a period of time. We were actually hearing at NCLC from advocates in North Carolina who had a case where there were, I believe, 120 heirs. So you can imagine, and in many states, you often have to probate the estates of everyone who's passed and who had that ownership interest in order to finally get that title cleared up. So not fun. So one of the things that NCLC has been really pushing in terms of helping folks to clear title is the use of, for example, heirship affidavits. So allowing folks who live in the home to attest that they have this ownership interest and then use that to be able to manage the property in certain ways. And so you could use an heirship affidavit, for instance, to access disaster relief and recovery funds. For instance, FEMA actually a few years back after Hurricane Maria, where there was so much inability to access disaster funds because of informal title, revised their proof of ownership standard so that folks would be able to use self-declarative affidavit in order to show that they had an ownership interest in the home. Because you can imagine, if you're in the midst of recovering from a disaster, it's too time-consuming and it's too complicated to then seek probate for potentially generations and generations of heirs. Another facet in which this can be incredibly useful is the property tax system. I mentioned it a bit before, and as Andrew was saying, one of the ways in which folks really are losing their property oftentimes is through the property tax sale system. And heirs property owners oftentimes aren't able to get the full exemption for property tax relief that many jurisdictions make available. And so at NCLC, one of the things we've been pushing for is encouraging states and localities to increase the use of these heirship affidavits and allowing that to be a proof of ownership. Because in many cases, if someone's living in the home, they're paying the taxes, there's no reason why they should need to have record title and then also get the agreement of all 30, 40, 50 heirs in order to benefit from the home that they're living in and they're managing. And then one of the other things we've been doing on the prevention side of things is really looking into and encouraging in a lot of places the use of transfer on death deeds, which are a form of avoiding probate. So transfer on death deeds allow folks to essentially designate a beneficiary in the property in their home, and then recording that in the deed records. And then after they pass away, the property then goes directly to the beneficiary that was noted. And so this is a lot less time consuming than probate often can be, particularly if the main asset you have is just your home. And it allows folks to really enter into this system of transferring property quite more easily. It's not as expensive and not as time consuming as writing a will and then probating that will might be. But even so, there are some reasons why folks might want to go through probate as well. And so in those instances, we're also encouraging, and we mentioned this in a report, the different types of state laws that make probate simpler and easier for families. So, for example, this can include probate waivers for families who are maybe cash poor, although they may be asset rich. So considering the fact that even if an estate is worth X amount of dollars because the home is worth that amount, that people are not selling their home in order to pay to probate their home. So in making sure that the probate waivers and exemptions, that they keep that in mind. Another aspect as well is maybe increasing the amount of exemptions from traditional formal probate standards. In some states, if you are a surviving spouse, for instance, you're able to use what is called a summary probate process, which is much more simple. So if maybe perhaps you are a family member who's closer, making sure that we're increasing the access points for folks to get into the probate system should they so choose. And then I guess the final thing that I mentioned in terms of the work that we've been doing, both on the NCLC side of things and the LCE side of things, is I think also relates to something that Natasha said about the legal deserts. And I think on that point, the fact is, even in places where there are a lot of lawyers and where there are even well-established legal services organizations, the fact is that not many lawyers are doing this kind of work. There's very much a gap. There are a lot of lawyers who are working on trusts and whatnot for folks who are making $1 million, $2 million or more and have that much in assets. There aren't as many lawyers who are interested in doing that work, or who have the skill, I should say, or the training or expertise in doing that work for folks who are just trying to pass their home down to another generation. And so making sure that we're building up the reservoir of attorneys who can do this work for low-income families and for marginalized communities is really important as well, because again, there's just so few lawyers who are available to do this work in so many places. And even where they do exist in certain states, again, because there's so few of them, these places, they are overworked and they simply can't help everyone who needs this work. So there's an increasing need for, again, building up the capacity for this, and a lot of, money to fund organizations to build up their to build up their capacity for this work. And I think that's why it's really encouraging to see that DC has taken this on and has committed, I believe it's $1 million to organizations who are doing this work and to build up this work in the district. Philadelphia also, I think, has a very vibrant community of folks who are working on heirs property as well. And then there are many others across the country starting to do this work.
Great, thank you for sharing those. And Kevin, on a similar, sorry, not Kevin, Andrew, on a similar vein, excuse me, in your research findings, were there some recommendations for localities, municipalities to implement to address some of the issues you laid out?
Yeah, I mean, there are a variety of, for one, is getting more involved in the local politics and in the matters of sort of who is administering local tax systems. I think there's been a growing awareness in many cities of this long-standing problem of the overtaxation of Black and brown neighborhoods that has led to political change. In Chicago, for instance, there's a reform assessor who was elected in 2017. The city of Philadelphia actually just released a report a couple weeks ago, finding that again, surprise, surprise, there's Black and brown neighborhoods in that city are experiencing overtaxation, and the mayor has committed herself to taking measures to address it. But at a sort of at a sort of policy level, I mean, one of the sort of more effective strategies, at least for sort of ensuring that people are not going to be taxed out of their homes or sort of face the kind of problems that we've been discussing here that lead to home and land loss, are things like circuit breakers, which ensure that you're not going to be paying taxes above a certain income level as well. So I mean, so these are sort of strategies that are happening at the local level. In addition, I think too, the work of say public interest law firms that are working on issues like say heirs property. There's a couple in the South that are worth noting. The Center for Heirs Property Preservation, based out of South Carolina. Also the Appleseed Foundation, which has several chapters across. But I think the one thing that this really also highlights is how many of the heirs property in particular, and some of the challenges is how that intersects with tax inequities, had long been understood and thought of as a rural problem. And again, for good reason, in the sense that a lot of the land that was lost in the 20th century were in rural areas. But we're really finding just how pervasive this problem is in cities, and how this is now something that is really becoming forced partition sales. This kind of equity theft is really happening in gentrifying urban markets across the country. And so I think this is something where now this needs to be woven into a lot of the housing activism that's happening in cities, and not just simply understood as a problem that was facing Black farmers in the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And on a policy vein, Kevin, I know that you've done some work around federal policy, so wondering if there's recommendations, things ongoing and recommendations for
Absolutely.
Policy.
But when you're talking about, before I get to the federal part, when you're talking about partition sales, I think we would be remiss not to mention the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act that has thankfully been passed in, I think it's 23 states in the district, am I right?
5?
20, is it 25?
I think it's 25.
I'm good with the higher number, that's fine. Let's keep it going. But I think it's a great piece of state legislation that allows some recourse for families that face this issue, to allow them to a series of simple due process protections, whether it be fair notice that someone has acquired a fractional ownership and is forcing a sale, a fair appraisal to make sure that if the sale goes through, they have they are getting the market value for the home, and making sure this is not being sold for pennies on a dollar, as I said before, and then making sure that heirs have the right of first refusal to protect them from speculators coming in and buying up their generational home from out of front of them. So I think there's some great work being done at the state level, and then at the federal level, while, as we all know, housing is mostly done at the state and local level for various good reasons. So the federal level, it's kind of like giving that carrot to states to incentivize them to pass good legislation like the UPHPA. So there are two pieces of legislation that have been introduced this Congress that I'm actually very excited about. The first ties directly to the UPHPA. So Congresswoman Nketia Williams from Georgia, along with Lizzie Fletcher from Texas, Emmanuel Cleaver from Missouri, and Byron Donalds from Florida, along with 12 other co-sponsors, but that was the core group that introduced the legislation, introduced the Heirs Estate Inheritance Resolution and Succession Act, the HEIRS Act. It's a lot of words for one acronym. But it incentivizes states to pass the UPHPA or some similar act that protects the consumer. There are some states that didn't, directly adopt the UPHPA model, but adopted something very similar. And what this would do is, to those states that have adopted it, there's 2 grant programs in there, kind of going back to Ink's display of the different ways you can deal with heirs property through the resolution. So it's a $300 million grant program over the next 10 years from HUD to provide states with funds to help people clear their title, whether it's legal fees, finding a lawyer, things like that, things that some people just don't have the access to who need the help. It is grants to the states to then disperse to folks to help facilitate those things. And then as well as another $10 million over 5 years for housing counseling assistance to be able to educate folks about heirs property and about estate planning, making sure that they understand the importance of estate planning if they find themselves with heirs property, how to get out of it. So I think it's a really great 2-pronged approach, coming out of the federal government to both incentivize states to pass the UPHPA, but also to put some money behind these efforts, because I think that's something the federal government's really good at doing. So we should, find them a good way to channel that energy towards. And then back to what Ink was saying before about the alternative forms of ownership, whether it be the heirship affidavits or something. You mentioned that FEMA changed their guidelines a few years ago. Well, there's a bill that was just introduced by Lizzie Fletcher and Nikema Williams again that would amend HUD regulations to do something similar for the CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant, both disaster recovery and mitigation loans, to be able to take for folks who find themselves with heirs property who don't have a clear title with their name, to use alternatives to access those funds as well. So I think being able to, as we've talked about, broaden the umbrella of available resources to folks who find themselves with heirs property who haven't yet been able to untangle that title is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for mentioning those. With the FEMA work, the FEMA changes that you both mentioned, in the very first year that they implemented it, I think the report they gave that $350 million additional were given out with the changes of accepting an affidavit that would have been rejected the year before. So it's just showing that there really is a need for these changes, and I guess we're still waiting to see what happens with these bills that have been introduced. Is that correct?
Yes, they've just been introduced. They are gaining momentum. It was literally earlier this month for homeownership for a month. So they're gaining momentum, but any of you who have colleagues that work in the federal advocacy space, happy to connect with them. We're making a big push to get as many co-sponsors on these bills. As we all know, homeownership is not a partisan issue. These are bills that are going to help people, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, in red states, blue states, in rural or urban. This is an issue that doesn't discriminate, although it disproportionately impacts people of color, of course. So I think, as much awareness around these bills and around these funds to help these families that are impacted by this issue is the better. The more we can do, the better.
Definitely. And then I just want to make one quick comment to lead into my question to you all before I open up to the audience for questions. When you mentioned the UPHPA, it's a great legislation that's been passed and it's gaining momentum, so we hope to see it passed in as many states as possible. And there's a really great opportunity for the housing sector to collaborate with the legal sector in that space. For example, one of the provisions of the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act is the allowance of the heir who wants to keep the property to buy out the interest of the other heirs. But I know someone came to me today and said you can buy out 10 heirs with $50,000, I would lose my property. So how many people have the money sitting around to be able to buy out those interests for that property? So is there a way, the question that I think we're hoping to present to the many brilliant minds in this room and anyone we can come across is there a way for housing finance to provide those monies? Is it so unlike a mortgage, in non-technical ways, right? But you're trying to purchase a property. So is there a way we can think about this in a way of someone purchasing a property to be able to have those buyout fees to then come alongside? And then with the housing counting that you mentioned, Ink, and correct me if I'm saying this incorrectly, but attorneys cannot solicit. Is that I'm saying that accurately? So in some communities we're seeing where the housing counselors who are embedded in communities are frequent touch points for folks who are looking for assistance to say, oh, you have a title issue, instead of saying, well, you're not eligible for the housing program, saying, actually, here's an attorney you can call. Here's the legal aid that you can access. Here are the steps that you need to take, because they can be referral sources to attorneys who are not able to solicit based on their regulations, guidelines for their profession. So there's so many ways that there can be collaborations to support the ongoing work and to continue to move it forward. So my question to the panelists are, what are some examples of the collaborations that you've had since we're here celebrating 3 years of collaboration? What are some collaborations that you all have had that have been successful, and who do you want to collaborate with, or who would be helpful to collaborate with? What sectors, which people, which organizations to be able to advance the recommendations and things you put forth?
Well, I can go ahead. So I'll highlight one collaboration that we just finished with a few weeks ago, and we being legal counsel for the Elderly Aid DC affordable law firm. I believe it was Legal Aid DC, and the DC Bar, and a few other organizations as well. So a few weeks back, we put on a community outreach event with hosting with Hill Civic East Association, I believe, an organization based in the district. And they used, so this is a community civic organization that has a lot of contacts, this is a touch point for folks in their neighborhoods. And so they reached out to, I believe it was the affordable law firm, seeing if there was any way they could collaborate, helping folks, getting folks information on foreclosures, reverse mortgages, estate planning, and property taxes. And so as part of this grant that the district had given to LCE and DCALF, we hosted an event at St. Coletta's near the Stadium Armory metro stop. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar, in Southeast DC, and had folks come in, and then we had 3 different rooms where we had folks where we were able to give folks information about whether they were behind on their property taxes, whether they were on the title to their deed for their home, whether they, what an estate plan would look like for them, giving them the space to really think about all of these questions and all of these issues in a very, in less of the acute disaster way that many of these issues often come up, such as a tax foreclosure, disaster, or what have you. And so I mentioned that because I think that was a really good example of us collaborating with a community organization that already has connections, that's already built in the trust and has an earned reputation, and then also bringing in all the legal stakeholders as well, so that folks are able to see that this is where they can go to get information, this is where they can go to receive assistance. And so as part of that event, we also had intakes as well, so that folks could get followed up with by many of these organizations. So that's an example of the way some of this collaboration could work. I'd also mention, I think there's a lot of opportunity for financial institutions, for instance, and legal organizations and advocacy organizations to combine and work together. As you were saying about the buyout, I think there are a lot of things we could brainstorm in terms of products where maybe a partial ownership interest that the person has is enough to secure a loan that's then used to buy out the interests of others for a UPHBA buyout. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, I would agree. I think some of the best is like the collaboration to come. I think there's so many conversations that have happened over the last several years. I mean, I remember when I started at Alta and started looking at the issue of heirs property, it was really only a USDA relending program that was available to help people. And while absolutely helping farmers and ranchers is very important, there's so many other people to be impacted by this. So I think if I had to pick out one collaboration, it would be Congresswoman Nketia Williams coming to Alta and saying, this issue, I know, has to deal with title. My family is a victim of heirs property, and we have a property that is fall under this. What can Congress do? What can we do? And taking that relending program, using it as a model, but making it not a relending program, making it a grant program to give people who need the access to legal services or just need money to help, whether it be buy out an heir or just understand the process to tangle this title and save their family home, I think is such a great way to use Congress, as slow as it sometimes may be, but they do have a lot of power to be able to make a difference.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm an academic, and I'm sort of stepping into new spaces here with the writing of this book, and I think over the last several years I've really been more soliciting insight and from experts, including folks associated with the organizations here on this stage. I've been talking a lot with over the years with John Rouse, senior attorney at the NCLC, who really who wrote this really excellent report on the tax foreclosure crisis in 2012, and so in a sense, like what I've been really been working a lot on is trying to piece this together and understand some of the sort of the laws and policies that help then inform my own historical contextualization of them. And I think right now, I mean, my real interests are taking the history that I've been working on and the issues that I'm sort of laying out here, and now sort of putting them into action in terms of policy changes, in terms of actually historically informed policy proposals that can actually sort of draw upon some of the lessons of the past. And so in a sense, like working with groups like the NCLC, the Center for Community Progress, which has done a lot of work looking at some of the problems of vacant and abandoned property and the ways in which that has sort of created some of these exploitative practices in urban housing markets, as well as some of the folks who are working specifically on state and local taxation here in DC, has been really exciting for me, because too often historians and academics, we sort of identify problems, we write about them, we decry them, but then we don't actually sort of translate that work into actually sort of meaningful change. And I think that's been a source of frustration for me throughout my career, because I feel unsatisfied with just simply kind of identifying problems that are longstanding, but rather sort of doing something about them. And so this has been a real, it's been kind of new for me coming into sort of these spaces, but one that I'm really excited to continue to sort of work toward. So.
Great, thank you all. Any comments before I open up to the audience for questions? Okay, well, we have some time for some questions if any folks would have anything or comments, things to share.
Hi, my name is Jordan Harris from Compass Working Capital. I noticed on the map that a lot of the, I think it was the constant poverty, was kind of centralated towards the south. And I do remember the 1619 project, they did a article and a documentary on like black farmers. And I was just curious about if you noticed any, like what professions, like what areas, people who were going through, these problems, what were they working with? Was it like agricultural workers and stuff like that?
Thanks for your question. So with a lot of the heirs property research, well, let me pause and say, heirs property research really grew out of, as some of the panelists mentioned, out of noticing the black farm land loss. Our research wanted to supplement that, looking at specifically residential properties, since we work in the residential space. So there is quite a bit of documentation around the fact that a lot, specifically black farmland, was lost in part due to title issues. In terms of the map I presented here, we did not have access to personal information about the owners of the property for protection reasons, because we don't want data being transferred around that's saying, Natasha Moodie, black female, this profession has an heirs property in this location. But so we don't have information about the professions. But in terms of the patterns, part isn't due to the fact that it lines up with any other map around systemic disinvestment. You kind of line them up, you'll see heirs property later as another layer on top of other maps of systemic disinvestment. But I will note, with our research, part of the findings are due to the data source that we had and the methodology that we used. And so there are some local research on local levels that there's no one way to identify heirs property as of 2024. Everyone's working together to try to figure out the best way to do that. And so part of the map is one, just really not shocking in terms of, if you look at persistent poverty maps, redlining maps, food desert maps, they're all going to pretty much line up with heirs property in a lot of ways. But I don't have a professions answer to you at this moment. I'm not sure if any of the panelists have come across.
Great explanation.
Denise.
Hi. First of all, Andrew, I want to congratulate you on the book. I saw the op-ed that you wrote in the New York Times and shared it widely. So I have a question for you. In the work that you've done, I'm just curious what opposition you have seen to the acknowledgement of the black tax, particularly with respect to city assessments, and what justifications have you seen for maintaining it or other resistance to addressing it?
That's a good question. I think it's almost sort of undeniable in the sense of actually, you can't deny the sort of evidence as plain as day. I mean, in terms of the actual existence of these assessment inequities, then the question then becomes is what is driving this, and then what to do about it. And that's where the sort of debates really begin in terms of, how do we actually sort of, there's a lot of sort of questions as to sort of what are the factors that are explaining why, can these be solved by sort of small, more technical solutions? in the assessor's office, or are they systemic and actually sort of problems that are rooted in the sort of fiscal framework of how we tax property and what those property taxes are used for? And so I think in some respects that's where really a lot of the kind of real hard debates that are really that don't actually break down neatly along ideological lines either, because there's folks on the left and on the right who sort of think that there is something to be there's something very important about maintaining local tax systems in their current form, and that the property tax as a local tax, and I think this is something I always strain to make clear, and sometimes get readers of, say, like that op-ed who maybe only read the headline, which I think was a little sort of deliberately provocative, and that's what the New York Times wants to do, is get clicks, so I understand. But nevertheless, I think it can be misread as me arguing that like the property tax is a inherently bad tax, and in fact nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, it's the only tax on wealth that we have in this country, but the local nature of it then poses all these problems in how it's administered, and that's what I really try to sort of focus on, is like you need to get beyond just the tax policies themselves and actually look at the administration of any laws and policies, and that's where you can begin to find some of these problems lurking in the shadows. And I think that's something that I really sort of emphasize and focus on, and I'm not, I don't necessarily think that these can be solved at a local level on themselves, because so many of them are rooted within a broader framework that leads to, say, some cities having ample resources and lots of property and wealth and property, and others utterly bereft of it and are struggling to keep the lights on and the streets clean and the water clean. And I think this is something that, and also one of the downstream effects of these inequities within local tax bases is that it leads cities into these sort of predatory relationships, whether it be with tax buyers, whether it be through kind of reliance on fines and fees and other sort of measures that kind of disproportionately affect Black and brown populations. So I think a lot of this is very much, we need to look at the system as a whole and how the structure has been built comprehensively. But also I think that's something where the solutions are going to be tough, and they actually have to require us to think more broadly and comprehensively about how do we sort of raise and spend the public's money ultimately, and how do we ensure that our tax policies are not making the problems that taxes are meant to solve, like building a better, more equal society, making those problems worse, which I think is actually what local tax systems today are doing. They're actually sort of exacerbating the very problems that public dollars should be addressing. So yeah.
Thank you. I think probably time for one more question, if there is one. Okay, well, I would like to thank the panelists for sharing their insights and expertise. Thank you to the Black Homeownership Collaborative for having us. And thank you all for being here for this session at the end of the day. Most greatly appreciated.